Welcome, fellow travelers along the highway of life. You have made it to the Midnight Truck Stop with your hosts, Big T and Blue Knight. This is where you will hear stories from the highway by people who've experienced them firsthand. Everyone's welcome, so pull up a chair, gather around the campfire, and join us as we dive into strange, funny, and sometimes frightening experiences that so many of us have had while traveling the highway.
We are back. Episode number 4.
That's right.
What do we got in store, Blue Knight?
Well, today's a very special episode. We came across a group called Truckers Against Trafficking, and we are going to have two ladies from that organization, Miss Annika Huff and Miss Helen Hoffer, talk about their efforts in combating human trafficking throughout the United States and educating both law enforcement and truck drivers as to what to be aware of to put an end to this, what's called a modern-day slavery.
Sounds interesting to me.
Sure is. And I'll tell you, both of these ladies have done a tremendous amount of work. They actually have their own podcast where they talk not only to law enforcement personnel, they talk about some of the success stories, people being rescued from human trafficking, and I'm really looking forward to this talk. I think it's going to be very valuable, not only to increase our knowledge about human trafficking, but for all of our listeners out there.
All right, I can't wait to hear their stories.
I want to thank Miss Annika Huff and Helen Hoffer from Truckers Against Trafficking for joining us here today and talking about their vital role in educating the public, truck drivers, law enforcement, about what's been called this modern-day slavery, which truly impacts so many people, not just the victims and the victim's family, but as I said during our conversation before, it exponentially just affects so many people. And I'm really excited about this because in doing our research and reaching out to Truckers Against Trafficking, we were put in touch with you two ladies, and I mentioned before to you off air that the name Annika Huff just kept ringing in my ear, and I thought, where have I heard this name before? And come to find out, Annika actually taught at one of the conferences on human trafficking that I attended about a year and a half ago, and I'm so excited because now I don't just get to listen, but I get to ask you questions, and you gave a wonderful presentation then. I'm sure you're going to give us a wonderful presentation today. And so I invite both of you. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us. We're so glad to be here. Excited that you are starting this podcast and invited us to be on. So thank you for having us today and for recognizing the importance of talking about this issue.
You're welcome. You know, we touch on so many different topics on this podcast, and a lot of it are strange encounters on the road. We've had some UFO stories, Bigfoot stories, but we really wanted to interject an educational piece. And in delving into this trucker community, we found so many different organizations that do such good work. And when I came across Truckers Against Trafficking, I'm like, I got to get somebody on from that organization. Definitely. Because we were so excited. But let's start off with having you both tell us a little bit about yourselves and why you joined this organization and became a part of it.
Yeah, and I do have to say, when you first wrote us about the podcast and then I listened to your first episode, I was like, do they think human trafficking is as strange as these other things? I mean, I want to know that this is like fairly normal.
Yeah. No. Yeah, we get it.
Yes, and I'm glad you clarified that you're bringing on other guests and everything. That's like,
we are. And you know, other people have shared your concern because they'll listen to the podcast and they're like, do I really fit in? And I'm like, yes, because we want to make this different. We want it to be an educational piece. And we always have time. There's plenty of people that have these strange stories that are really like exciting to listen to. But we figured if we could bring an educational piece into this, that it would just benefit everybody. So thank you.
Definitely. Yeah. So Truckers Against Trafficking, we're a nonprofit. We started in 2009. So just over, I feel like time flies. Now it's way past sort of 10 years running.
Yeah.
But we exist, we recognize that there is an intersection between, initially, right, it was this intersection between the trucking industry and human trafficking, recognizing that traffickers were exploiting these locations. They were selling people for commercial sex at truck stops, rest areas, hotels, motels, industrial areas where people are dropping off loads. That there were these cases that were coming up in these areas. And so how better than to train a group of people who are already equipped to know, like, have safety at top of mind, to be so observant to really want to make a difference, to not really have a bystander effect, but to always take action, what better than to equip these people with the knowledge and the truth of what human trafficking really is, so then they can report it safely and anonymously to the National Human Trafficking Hotline number, so we can see more victims recovered and more traffickers and buyers arrested. And so that's where Truckers Against Trafficking started, with that idea, hearing about cases at these locations, and then recognizing, okay, people are talking about training truck stops, and definitely do that, but what if we train the truckers? What if we train the people who are going to each of these different locations as well?
Right.
And so we started there. Yeah, right? And then a couple of years ago, we recognized that, okay, there are some other overlaps that we're seeing. So obviously we're seeing this in the trucking industry, but there's trucking related to the energy industry, right? I mean, people hauling sand, hauling water, and all involved in construction and all of that. And so, okay, but energy definitely has its own vibe, its own groove, right? When you talk about boom towns, or when you talk about areas of play, like there's all this different language and look of what it looks like in these areas, in the ways that the energy industry is and can combat it. So we started a whole Empower Freedom program that's working with and supporting the energy industry and providing tools for them to combat human trafficking.
And that's great.
And then, we are involved heavily in the area of providing training, right? So we're talking about the commercial driver's license, your CDL.
Right.
Who else is getting a CDL? Bus drivers.
Yep.
Right?
That's
and so we're talking about transit drivers, motor coach drivers, school bus drivers. They're intersecting with human trafficking. Yep. I mean, your school bus driver is you're talking about kids. You're seeing every day of the weekday. You're seeing them, and you're getting to see them. Like, okay, you're picking them up from their neighborhood, and how are they interacting socially? And you're seeing all these other components as well, adding into that school network, recognizing potential signs of abuse. And then, of course, for motor coach and as well as transit, traffickers are using these modes of transportation to either lure victims, saying, hey, I'm going to buy you a bus ticket, then you can come here where I am, kind of luring them away from a potential other safety net, as well as then obviously using buses to transport victims to potential places of buying. So where a buyer is. And so recognizing drivers or training drivers to recognize potential victims who could be either literally being trafficked while they're on that mode of transportation, or kind of to or from. They're trying to escape this location. What do they have money for? Do they have a car? How can they get out? Maybe they can get on a bus. And just what's the quickest way they can get somewhere? Yeah. And that could be a bus. And so
in human trafficking, it like I said, we know it's a problem everywhere, but it's a really tricky thing to try and diagnose this problem in the trucking community. Maybe diagnose is not the right word, but I was reading some articles about truckers who have actually participated in human trafficking that have gotten, many years sentence in federal prison for transporting victims across state lines and things like that. But time and time again, these articles are talking about how difficult it is because truckers are so transient and they're going from place to place, and it's not like they're just hitting one location and committing this criminal activity. They're moving across state lines. They're not often in one place for a long period of time, and so that puts an extra stress on law enforcement to try to figure out just who's trafficking these people, and these victims. And then something like your podcast and your educational efforts really help because they're helping all truckers across the nation to understand what's going on, to be aware of certain things.
Yeah, and I mean, we're partnering with the National Human Trafficking Hotline number. So they're a separate organization based out of DC, but they have a nationwide network. Then we can give one number, and that one number will lead to connections to victim resources, connections to law enforcement, wherever you are in the country that are trained and equipped to approach these situations, to respectfully work with survivors, as well as then get those law enforcement involved who are trained and equipped, and the designated people in those areas to handle human trafficking cases. So fantastic. It's perfect for the transportation industry. It's perfect for people who are moving all across the country, or even just all across their region.
Wow. Yeah. Great work, ladies. Can we talk about some of the lesser known truths about human trafficking? Would that be okay?
Yeah, and I definitely want Annika to hop in and talk more about her experience. I mean, so Annika, you're newer to TAT, which is exciting, and to share kind of how you got in with us, because I mean, then you talk about this whole other mode of what TAT does as well in your job.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. I became involved in TAT originally first in 2017. I'm in their Busting on the Lookout, or their bottle training video,
Okay.
because I'm a survivor. I was recruited at a local bus stop. And so I have a lot of the transit pieces, and I use transit. I didn't get my driver's license until I was 22. I loved public transportation. So
Okay.
I've seen it a lot in a lot of different ways, whether that was across country travel or at local bus stops that I had used within Las Vegas, where I have family, where I was trafficked, and where most of my experience of seeing trafficking happening on bus stops had occurred.
Right.
So that's how I originally got involved. In 2018, I had done my first law enforcement training with Kyla Lanier, who's the deputy director of TAT. And from that point on, I started continuously doing law enforcement trainings with TAT. And in 2019, I was hired as a part-time employee to do more law enforcement trainings. And that year, I think we did 35 law enforcement trainings.
Wow.
And then hired full-time in 2020. So.
Okay. Wonderful. So, like I said, there's a lot of misinformation about trafficking, right? But we really want to, kind of clear the air. I know you'll be the perfect person to talk about things like grooming and the force, fraud, and coercion that is so wrapped up in this industry. So, if you could just speak about that, I think that would be really valuable to our listeners.
Absolutely. So. Force, fraud, and coercion. Those are the main things you have to have legally to have a human trafficking case in the United States for an adult. For any minor who is performing commercial sex acts, that is automatically a human trafficking case. But force, fraud, and coercion, force can be anything you can think of, from beatings, rapes, threats of violence, any type of force or physical violence you can think of. Fraud is going to be false promises. Now, this can include things like wages or working conditions or things like that we can see a lot of the times in foreign national victims. But this also can be false promises about employment, about becoming a model or something of that nature, and things like that. And then coercion are going to be threats. Now, that's threats to that victim's lives, that victim's reputation. Oh, I'll share these photos all over the internet, or to your school, or to your parents, or to your church group, something like that. And it also can be threats towards their family members and their loved ones. And this is one of the most common types of tactics that traffickers are going to use to trafficking victims, is that coercion piece. As far as grooming goes, grooming is something that happens before trafficking actually begins.
Right.
So grooming is a time period where the trafficker is going to focus in on a potential victim. And during that grooming time, they're going to learn the history, their vulnerabilities, their life that they had before they potentially met this person.
Right.
So this can include things like if they were a foster youth, what was their relationship with their family? Was there sexual abuse? Things of that nature. They'll create a relationship, and that can be a boyfriend-girlfriend relationship, which is very common in the U.S. Or this can be a friendship, or I'll protect you, and I'll be a protector, and we can, make a good life for each other, and that type of thing. So it's just creating that relationship with that person, and then they create a dependency. And that's the trafficking victim or potential trafficking victim is becoming dependent on the trafficker for love, for basic necessities, for whatever that victim specifically needs, and whatever way that they're going to be able to force that victim into trafficking situations.
So during that grooming period, is this kind of a period where the traffickers themselves are, they're nice, they're polite, they don't really engage in verbal or physical abuse? They want to kind of befriend the victim, and then the verbal and physical abuse is something that happens later on in the relationship? Yeah, it's not even
Absolutely.
a relationship, but in the
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the grooming time, the trafficker is going to present their absolute best self. Most of the time, they're not going to discuss what their actual intentions are for the victim.
Sure.
They're not going to discuss commercial sex at all. They will pretend to be something that they're completely not, and pretend that they have ulterior motives for this person.
Okay. And I'm sure that they're playing on this victim's emotion. So if this victim came from maybe a broken home, then they act as like this loving, caring figure that's going to take care of them and befriend them and gain their trust, and then move them into being even more of a victim through trafficking later on. Is that right?
Absolutely. Yeah. So in my circumstance, I had multiple traffickers had groomed me because it apparently was very easy for traffickers to see that I was an easy target. And now looking back, now that I'm much older, I was a 17-year-old kid walking around Las Vegas, the wrong side of town,
right,
during the day when I should have been in school. And so those experiences I had are a reason why I definitely focus on the grooming time. The first one was a female who had groomed me, and she came in as somebody who would be a potential friend. And it wasn't until after I went through my own trafficking experience that I realized, oh, that's what she was doing.
Yeah.
And that's what she was going to do. And she became a friend that I really needed at that point in my life. And then the next one, like clockwork, she met my dad, and I think she realized my relationship with him was too strong. So she left.
Oh,
she
wow.
went to California after that. And then the next one came in 2 weeks later. And I thought him and I were dating for 4 months. And the only reason that I had not been trafficked by this man was because I noticed something was just a little bit off. And I did some detective work and did a background check on him.
Oh, wow.
And that's when I ended up blocking his phone number. But that grooming, the need, the vulnerability, and the grooming that they had already instilled in me was a part of what was going on with me in this time period. So when my trafficker came in, he came in at the right time when the perfect storm of issues were going on in my life. And it was very easy to immediately get me into trafficking from that point on.
Wow. And you actually testified against your trafficker, right?
I did, yes. It took 2 years, but he was sentenced with 15 charges. He was found guilty, including sex trafficking. He was sentenced to life in prison. So.
Wow.
Oh.
So there's a silver lining to that story. That's wonderful. She took somebody like that off the streets. When I was looking into more and more into trafficking, when we knew we were going to have you both on the show here, I started looking at different cases, and there's quite a lot of cases involving truck drivers just because of the nature of the job and the transient nature. And I don't know. I mean, I guess the settings with these truck stops and the prevalence of human trafficking there. And I found on more than a couple occasions when people talked about these traffickers, they were saying how there was almost and not for all, but for some victims, there was almost like a Stockholm Syndrome where even though they hated their trafficker and for what he was doing to them, they had some sort of compassion, like they had there was some bond between them. Do you think that's often the case?
Yeah, I definitely think that's the case. I think that from that grooming time that creates that bond of a relationship, whatever that relationship may be, it definitely turns into what we call trauma bonds. So they're a little different than Stockholm Syndrome to a degree, but they're very similar. They're very parallel in a lot of ways. And I mean, even with my own experience, I see the compassion, the issues that my trafficker had grew up with. So there is a sense of, there's a sense of connection for the experience that we had lived through. And in my experience, I think there's a lot of different people that you can trauma bond with. So the girl I was trafficked with,
yes,
I trauma bond with a lot more than my own trafficker.
Okay.
So it can be very, there's a lot of layers in trauma that's connected to trafficking situations. But in most cases in the U.S., the traffickers are specifically looking for younger victims that they can create a boyfriend-girlfriend relationship, boyfriend-boyfriend relationship, whatever that relationship will be. They're looking for that love connection because that is unfortunately so deep, and it very much parallels domestic violence in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I would imagine so.
And
Go ahead.
And I have to say also that just because someone might be younger doesn't mean that they're like a child, right? I mean, we see adult victims of human trafficking.
Yes.
And that can come out of, right, I mean, Annika says she was 17, right? I mean, almost 18. So we're not talking about necessarily any cases that talk about such young kids. We can talk about someone who's in their 20s, in their 30s, in their 40s.
Wow.
If they have vulnerabilities, and a trafficker is identifying that, they will exploit that. And so just the age, obviously, like Annika was sharing earlier about, I secretly filmed us like having sex, and I'm going to share this with your school.
So the whole,
and that obviously that can hold a lot of weight to someone who maybe is younger and in high school, but that doesn't mean there aren't vulnerabilities for people who are older as well.
How common is it to see older women?
Older as in like the victim is older than like 20 or something?
Yeah, late, mid-20s.
I don't have the statistics.
Yeah, I don't know if there's statistics on it.
Okay.
There's a lot of focus on younger kids, right? I mean, they talk about the average age of entry being, 16 years old or something like that. But that's only for minors. You're counting the population of 18 and younger and when they were first trafficked. It's not looking at the older. But certainly anecdotally, I hear people talk about people who are in their 40s, people who are in their 30s, and then more often people who are in their 20s. Now that's anecdotally, so I'd be interested to see more of that range. But I think part of that is also you have to think of what data is coming in, right? So who is recognizing a victim who's 40 versus saying, oh, you're just a prostitute. Like you have made this choice.
That's what I was going to ask.
How often are... What was that?
Well, that was my next question is it harder to build a case when somebody's in their 30s or 40s?
Well, it's definitely harder to build a case for anyone over 18, basically 18 and older, because if you're a minor and you're involved in commercial sex, you're automatically a victim of sex trafficking.
Right.
So
Gotcha.
Annika was talking about force, fraud, and coercion, and you don't have to prove those. It's simply, are you a minor? Are you involved in commercial sex? Can we prove that point? You're a victim of sex trafficking, then you get access to other services potentially, and then the particular charge is then more harsh for youth involved in sex trafficking for the trafficker. So then you have that whole legal component of it. As soon as you hit 18, then you have to prove that this wasn't anything else, that there were force, fraud, and coercion. So for that reason, yes.
Gotcha.
Got it. And I think it's hard for a lot of people who have not been involved in or been educated on human trafficking to understand why victims can't simply walk away. But it all plays into this whole manipulation. I think you mentioned these traffickers are master manipulators. They brainwash, their victims, and the victims feel like they can't walk away, that their trafficker will find them, that something bad will happen. Is that correct? Am I correct in stating that?
Absolutely. That's definitely the case. And each trafficker is going to identify what that victim is going to react to. So for me, my family was threatened a lot. And it was I think his main concern was me running. So if you run, I'll kill your family.
Okay.
If it's a girl that has a child with her trafficker, if you try to get away, I'm going to take my child away, or you'll never see your child again. And so whatever that is that the victim is most scared of, the trafficker is going to recognize that, and they're going to use that against them. So that way they won't leave. And to say that is a little bit, to say that they won't leave. It's like we don't have a choice in whether or not we can leave.
Right.
We just feel like there's no way out, which creates a real sense of hopelessness. And when there's no hope of escape, there's really no way out.
And that makes it
hard. I mean, you have to, beyond just the things that kind of keep someone with their trafficker, right? You're also thinking of what next? Like, what could I even do next? Like, how would people think of me? What do I put on my resume? I mean, like, it's do I want to be here or not? How high is that bar of what I'm willing to put up with? And then do I even see an option of something else I could do that could really get me out of this situation? And some of that weighs in on the choices of when do I try and run or try and get help or not? Because there are all these threats on one hand, and then what is my hope? What is my option? Like
Right.
if no one's communicating that to me, right, your trafficker's going to
Yeah.
really isolate this person from any option, from even knowing the word trafficking, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we talk about victims do not typically self-identify as victims, which makes it really difficult because then you're talking to someone, maybe, right? We have questions on our little tip sheet to kind of think through and look through for drivers to say, oh, is this a potential victim?
Yeah.
And a trafficking victim may not look like a victim because they may not even think of themselves that
Right.
way.
And that's why I think the education piece that you all do is so important, because both for law enforcement and for truckers out there who can see these different signs, it's a way into stopping human trafficking. I know from a law enforcement perspective, it's difficult because of this manipulative relationship. Sometimes the victims are not, they don't, come right out and say, hey, I'm being trafficked. Because like you said, they don't view themselves as being a victim. And so that makes it even more difficult for law enforcement. And, we had the opportunity to listen to your podcast with, I believe it was an Illinois state trooper who talked about, how he viewed things differently. And, you really do have a victim-centered approach, which, I don't know, maybe you can talk more about that, but that victim-centered approach.
So the victim-centered approach is the idea or concept that the care that you're giving to a case, whether or not you're law enforcement or you're a professional driver that sees a potential victim, you're giving the care surrounding the victim. So you're making sure that their wants, their wishes, their needs are met, especially when you think about those basic necessities, because in trafficking, we're not allowed to eat when we're hungry. We're not allowed to sleep when we're tired. We're not allowed to wear what we want to wear. We're not allowed to think and look at who we want to look at or think what we want to think.
Wow.
So those basic necessities, just asking a simple question like, are you okay?
Yep.
Can mean so much when somebody isn't getting their basic necessities met, when no one is caring about who and what's happening to them. So that can look different if you're a professional driver or a law enforcement officer, but it's really just about giving that care and that human kindness and dignity to that victim or that potential victim that has not been given to them in a very, very long time.
Yeah, and really opening your eyes to like looking at things from a broader perspective, because I noticed that when you were speaking with that Illinois state trooper on your podcast, he was mentioning how like he pulled over a car or something, if I remember correctly, and there was the trafficker and his victim, but he viewed the victim as part of the like the criminal investigation, right? Because he just saw it, okay, like they're in this car, they're committing criminal activity. I think it was narcotics or something like that. But really separating, like looking at these signs, like, okay, is this person, even though he or she may be engaged in criminal activity, are they engaged because they're being manipulated into doing that, because they're being forced into doing that, or are they a true suspect of a crime type thing? So I think that's the really important educational piece, because a lot of time these victims are just forced to do whatever their trafficker wants them to do. And so people need to really keep a broad perspective on things and look at the totality of the circumstances.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I mean, and that's one of the things that many survivors struggle with is clearing their record. Like, how difficult is it to get a job when you have all these things you were forced to do as a part of your trafficking, but are now on your criminal or on your record?
Right.
And how do you expunge that and explain over and over and over again the trauma that you went through to try and clear that record so you can simply get a job to support yourself, your family, your loved ones, like to move forward at all.
Right.
And so, I mean, and we're kind of touching this direction, but I love to highlight, sometimes people will see someone who's maybe high on drugs or alcohol, and you think of that as like, you are making poor life choices. Oh, now I see this connection to commercial sex. Like, oh, you're probably just selling yourself so that you can have drugs, more drugs.
Good point.
And recognizing that isn't always or even mostly the case, that if you are experiencing this kind of trauma day in and day out over and over again, what would it be worth to numb yourself, right? To consume something that will stop that feeling, that will stop that pain. That would be worth it, right? And so more often we're talking about, right, someone who is being trafficked, who is being abused, who then takes in these substances in order to, as a reaction to trafficking. Not they're trafficking because of the drugs, but rather they're consuming drugs because of the trafficking.
Right.
But then, of course, that creates this other layer of complication, right? When we're talking about why don't they leave?
Yeah.
So, okay, now you have this other layer of this drug addiction that has
Sure.
happened that was not your own choice, your own desire, but came out of trying to simply survive.
And I guess the big takeaway I get is if you're somebody who suspects somebody is being victimized, I think the first thing to do, because a lot of people don't understand or don't know how to approach somebody that they think may be victimized, but just simply walking up to somebody and asking them if they're okay. I think that opens a door, right?
And I would say, I mean, even thinking back to other success stories we know, like
Yeah.
one of our other staff members, she shares a story where she was sitting at a bus stop and it was raining and it was cold, and this bus driver came up, transit bus, and like, hey, do you want to get on the bus? Like,
Wow.
just to be somewhere warm.
Sure.
I have a sandwich that my wife made me. Can I give this to you? And she's like expecting this like exchange that he is like, okay, I'm going to pull over, like we'll have sex. That's my
Right.
payment. But he simply gave her a sandwich
Just
and gave
compassion.
her a ride on the bus.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think that there was any other interaction than that. And that kind of opening up the idea that, oh, I could be treated like this instead. Like
Yeah.
kind of that moment of, oh, there is something else. There could be something else.
Yeah.
That is so powerful.
Right.
And I mean, we say that and there could be that interaction, but I also want to say you don't actually have to interact with a potential victim. That's why we recommend the national hotline number. If you're seeing something, you're seeing some of these behaviors, some of these red flags, which we have listed on our website, we have in our training videos, we have on our wallet cards. Check out truckersagainsttrafficking.org for more
Yes.
information. But if you're starting to see those behaviors, you can simply call the national hotline number and report it to them, and then they can take those next steps. And so certainly we have drivers who have offered the sandwich, asked, how's your day going? Like, how's your
Right.
night going?
Right.
Kind of have done those, but also drivers who have put stickers on their trucks, on their personal vehicles with the national hotline number on it, who have simply called into the hotline. And that is very powerful. And I think we can often overlook what seems like a very simple act, but that can massively change someone's life.
Sure. Well, that's great. Now, you know what? You've had a lot of success stories. Would you mind sharing a couple of them with us?
Yeah, for sure. So I love that every year we highlight a Harriet Tubman Award winner. So shout out to everyone out there. This award goes out to drivers, professional drivers who've made a call, who have taken action that has directly impacted the life of a victim. And so this can be preventing it. This can be calling in interceding by calling in law enforcement or the hotline number, any of those things. And so these two stories that I think of are two of our Harriet Tubman Award winners.
Okay.
And so Arian Taylor, he was actually, and I especially love this story because it exemplifies that traffickers will do whatever they need to do to make money.
Right.
Like they will do whatever they do. So we may give examples of what trafficking looks like and where it happens, but just because it doesn't look just like that, just because it didn't happen in just that location, doesn't mean what you're seeing isn't necessarily trafficking. Because though he was, I think it was like 2 a.m., he had pulled up to the industrial area in Southern California. He was in line to then unload his load from his semi.
Right.
And so he's just sitting, waiting, and he hears this car tire, like this screeching sound. And he's like, oh, you know what? Actually, this area, there's like racing sometimes, and like you hear all sorts of noises in this area. So he didn't think too much of it. But then he sees this woman. She is holding, I think, a couple garbage bags. Seems like she's like carrying everything she owns, and realizes, oh, I think she was literally just kicked out of this car.
Wow.
And like in this area of town where there's like nowhere to go for help, there's like, it could be somewhat dangerous. It's dark. There's not a lot of other things going on in this area. Later, he talks about wondering like, oh, was she dropped off, to then kind of start panicking
Yeah.
And then when the trafficker drove around later and picked her up, then she felt like, oh, he's my only safe option. That's kind of like what he was thinking. But anyway, so this woman is walking around this area, actually comes up to his cab and knocks on his door.
Yeah.
You know, kind of like, okay, this person's coming up to my cab. Do I interact with them or not?
Right.
But just seeing the look on her face and seeing that she was carrying all that she owned and that she's starting to cry and is just trying to explain that, like, I am cold. I have nowhere to be. I was just like, I was in this area because I thought I was with a friend. Like, it was my friend and then her boyfriend. And we are traveling from out of state. We were supposed to be on this trip. And now, like, I've been kicked out.
Right.
So he lets her into the cab, and they actually keep having this conversation, and come to find out that he had been, this man in the car had been trying to get her to prostitute herself, trying to sell her to buyers to earn money so that they could, quote unquote, make it back home. Like, and come to find out, she actually only lives 4 hours away. And so the fact that he had enough gas to, like, drive her to this area of town, which is an hour outside LA, just felt like if you had enough to get there, then how do you not have enough to get back home or to get somewhere else?
Right.
And so that finds out that, okay, he was trying to tell this story to the woman and say, we need you to do this so that we can earn money, so that we can get home. And she was refusing. So he kicked her out, and she didn't, like, her cell phone wasn't charged.
Huh.
He had taken her ID. So all these little things that feel so little but are so important.
Sure.
Because Arian was like, oh, I'll take you to the bus station. I'll take you to the train depot. But she doesn't have any money. She doesn't have an ID. She doesn't have any way to access these services.
Right.
Which, I just am so caught up on, like, it seems like so simple, but it's so powerful. And then it's this manipulation, right? He then has this control over her that she doesn't have another way to get help. Or it didn't seem like she did, right?
Right.
And then Arian actually sees we have these window decals. He saw the window decal on the door of his truck and realized, oh, wait, this may be a trafficking situation.
Wow.
And he had actually already called a number of domestic violence shelters, just trying to find, like, assistance in the area. But again, it's like now 3 a.m.
Yeah.
And so he just, for whatever reason, that wasn't panning out. So he calls the hotline number. And they're like, yes, this is exactly the situation we're talking about. Thank you for calling us. Can you put this woman on the line? And so he steps out of the cab to give her some privacy. They have a conversation.
Right.
And then the hotline asks to put him on. Bottom line is they arrange a prepaid cab to pick her up, to take her to a safe house for the rest of for the rest of the night, for the rest of the day.
Wonderful.
So she can collect herself, charge her phone, just these little things, charge her phone, and then they were going to actually escort and transport her back to a place she wanted to go, which was different than the original home, because realizing, you know what, this place I came from maybe isn't the safe place that I want to go to. And so transported her wherever she wanted to go and took those actions. And so what a powerful story from, like, I'm dropped off, being manipulated and forced to be in this situation, to wow, like, I am getting a safe ride from a caring person who's, like, getting me water, getting me food. Like, this is the winter. I mean, it was January when it happened a couple years ago. And even in Southern California, which I guess is all comparative, but cold enough and wanting a safe place to be. And then within a couple, hours, is able to get a ride to another safe place, like out of state, where she can, really access better services that way. So that is so powerful. You just, from something so simple, like, you see someone wandering around in an industrial area, right? We're not talking about a truck stop or a rest area.
Right.
And so to be aware, no matter where it's happening. And
sure.
So that is.
Yeah. Big shout out to Arian Taylor. He did wonderfully that night. And if our listeners want to catch more of that story, it's on your latest podcast, right?
Yeah. So that story, we interviewed Arian. He's on our latest podcast episode. Our podcast is Driving Freedom.
Yep.
It's a Truckers Against Trafficking podcast. You can find it wherever you get your podcast. And we also interview him on our Facebook page for National Human Trafficking Awareness Month. So
awesome.
You can check either of those stories out.
Yeah, that's
you
so
can
wonderful.
You could also find our podcast on our website, under the main homepage, truckersagainsttrafficking.org. Go to resources. Under the resource tab, you can go to the Driving Freedom podcast. That's another way to access our podcast.
Yeah, and I'm doing it right now. It's so easy to get a link to that podcast. So anybody who wants to, truckersagainsttrafficking.org is the address, and right under resources there, you could get the podcast.
And we do have, because it was National Human Trafficking Awareness Month in January, we actually interviewed another Harriet Tubman Award winner, Kevin Kimmel, and so he's on our Facebook page. He's actually in one of our video resources as well, hearing his whole story of what he saw.
Okay, very good. Do you want to get into that story, or do you want to?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I love talking. So I didn't know if I was
great. We love listening.
Long, but
That's why we have a podcast.
yeah, I guess so, right? But yeah, Kevin. So he was at a truck stop. He was on his break, and so this was outside Richmond, Virginia, and it was late afternoon, and so he saw an RV in the back of the lot, like where all the trucks are.
Yeah. And
normally the RVers park in front, are only there overnight, and leave and drive during the day. And so it was just a little unusual that it was there, but there are a million reasons someone could be there. Maybe. There are at least some.
Yeah.
And so he didn't think too much of it. But then he saw a couple of different men going between the convenience store and the RV.
Okay.
And every time they'd go to the RV, they would knock on the door. And if it's your RV, why are you knocking?
Right.
Again, it could be reasons, but a little strange.
Yeah.
And then he saw a young woman stick her head outside the window of the RV, only to have it yanked back, a curtain drawn in its place, and then a commotion ensue inside the trailer.
Oh man.
And so, or inside the RV.
Right.
So at that point, he's like, whatever this is, this does not look good.
Yeah.
So he goes ahead and directly calls 911 because he sees an issue in progress, right? A potential very dangerous situation.
Yeah.
About 3:20, I think, in the afternoon, state troopers arrive on site. They are allowed in the RV by the occupants. The occupants, actually, this is all according to the report. They say, "Oh, we're just in the area visiting our daughter, this young woman who's in the RV with us."
Oh boy.
And in fact, they're being like really cordial with law enforcement, like talking about all these stories about the area and pointing out the window and talking about all these sights that they're going to see. And at that point in time, actually, when they point outside the window of the RV, one of the troopers keeps her eyes on this young woman. And it's at that point in time that the young woman does go ahead and make a silent cry for help.
Oh, wow.
And so at that point in time, the state trooper takes the young woman outside the RV. This young woman is actually, I believe, 20 or around 20, so she's over 18. And so she goes ahead and takes the woman outside the RV. But it wasn't even until she could not physically see the RV that she started to relax, and in fact started to just start crying and bawling and explaining, "I'm being held against my will. I have been physically and sexually abused by the suspects. They're threatening my family members, and I haven't eaten or had anything to drink for at least a couple of days."
Oh boy.
And so at this point, obviously, the remaining separated. Once the young woman is in the ambulance, right, because she was badly injured in a very bad state.
Yeah.
She told troopers that she had various burns on parts of her body. So they were actually, so we talk about branding when we talk about human trafficking. Normally,
Right.
I'm talking about a tattoo that shows ownership.
Right.
But in this particular case, we are literally talking about metal instruments being heated up on the RV stove and burning
Oh my
this
God.
young woman. Yeah. And so these were very violent traffickers. You'll have these, right, guerrilla traffickers, very violent traffickers. And so she had burns on various parts of her body. Some of these were infected, right? Because it's not like they weren't taking care of them.
Oh.
And so some of those were infected. She did actually try and run away. She had tried to get out, but they caught her, dragged her back, and they put nails into the bottom of her foot,
Oh boy.
telling her, "If you try this again, like, imagine what else we'll do to you."
Yeah.
Man.
And so she had all of that. And we're thinking, right, okay, so she tried to run away, so clearly, like, she's trying to make a game plan here. But they had actually forced her to call her family and tell them that nothing out of the ordinary was going on. I can't imagine being on the phone with my family,
Yeah.
anyone who might even think 2 cents about me,
Right.
and not being able to say anything about it, like not being able to actually, like, how to hold that together under such, like, the amount of trauma that situation
Just the
caused on
fear
top
and
of everything
control.
else that was happening.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And
Wow.
so, right, because like I said, she was like 20, in her 20s. And so it's like, oh, I'm out with my friends. It doesn't matter. I'm on a road trip. Just, it's fine. Don't bother me.
Yeah.
Don't report me, anything. And so just this feeling of no one is going to look for me.
Right.
Like no one knows that this is going on until, right, Kevin made that call. And so thankfully, at this time, she is back home in a safe environment, or she was able to go back home to a safe environment, and the two traffickers were arrested and sentenced to 40 and 41 years in prison.
Wow.
On a trafficking charge.
Wow. Which
And
is
so,
which is a light sentence
thankfully,
in my opinion.
I know.
Man.
I know.
Oh.
I like want to acknowledge it and want to say, like, okay, it was actually under trafficking, which obviously helps with a lot of other things to actually be able to label it as trafficking. But to say 40 and 41, right? It just never quite feels enough in that way.
Yeah.
But yeah, so we're amazing story.
Yeah, absolutely. The sentencing on a lot of these people, like Annika, I know that your trafficker got life in prison without parole, but I was really struck by some of the light sentences. And I mean, I'm talking, 20 years, but still, it's a light sentence considering how violent some of these, I think you called them guerrilla traffickers, are. So do you think there's some reform that needs to be done on that level in the justice system to increase penalties for trafficking?
I think so. I think absolutely. In my case, what he got for sex trafficking was 48 months. The life sentence was actually for first degree kidnapping.
Okay.
In the midst of my trafficking, there was a point where it turned into kidnapping because I had asked to leave. But if I didn't have that moment where I had the strength to even ask him to leave, and he beat me and forced me to not be able to leave, if I didn't have the strength to do that, he would have been out in about 10 years.
Wow.
So, that's a reality. I think the trafficking conviction's very low because of the difficulty in the cases, but also we need to get stronger charges against the traffickers and also the buyers. We often don't look at the buyers in these types of situations.
True. Yeah.
And I would like them to not get a slap on the wrist anymore, as they're creating the demand for this crime to occur.
Yeah, I was struck by this case, and I don't know if you are aware of it. There was a gentleman by the name of Timothy Vafedes. He was called the Vampire Trucker, and this guy was particularly brutal in his trafficking. He victimized, I think, there was a total of 6 women that he victimized, but he went so far. He had this fascination with vampires, and he went so far as to take a Dremel and to literally, you talked about branding, and that's what popped into my mind. He literally filed down their teeth so that they looked like vampires. And that guy got 20 years in prison. And he's gonna be released in another 15 years, and he's probably going to be in his early 60s, with probably in good health enough to victimize other people if he's not rehabilitated. And so I think there's a serious flaw in the justice system with sentencing, especially for somebody that's that brutal. So I completely agree with you that there does need to be some sort of reform.
Yeah, and the more that we address buyers, and even, beyond talking about sentencing, we want to talk about a culture, a community of people who don't allow that to happen, right? How many times is there a conversation, an offhanded joke, a sexist joke, something about someone who's being prostituted, that just kind of helps create this environment that says, oh, that's okay, just someone else is doing it.
Right.
Right? And so we actually have a demand resources page on our website. We have a man-to-man campaign about addressing demand, about having the conversation about sex buying with friends, family members, community members. We have a video that's meant to be like this conversation starter of like, oh, how am I what has taught me that I should say this is okay, or that I shouldn't say anything,
right?
When someone is saying, oh, I'm going to the strip club, or like I'm addicted to pornography, or I'm actually buying commercial sex.
Yeah.
Like, how are we able to have conversations with our friends and family members to say, oh, do you recognize the bigger picture here? Like when you're saying you're going to a strip club, actually, I know like if we're going to go to this level, like I know that there are victims of sex trafficking who have been trafficked out of strip clubs.
Right.
Like, and how are you to know whether that's a strip club or pornography that this person is an adult? Like, how do you know in this video? How do you know that this person is consenting?
Right.
Because there are all these other cases where that has not been the case, where that is what is being said, because that's what can be easily consumed when you say, oh yeah, this is consenting. They want to do this.
Right.
But that isn't the case. And I mean, if anyone's been paying attention to the news and listening to in December and January about Pornhub and just the trafficking cases that are being brought against them.
Yes.
I mean, that is just one example of a story that's saying, oh, this can be empowering if we just regulate it in the right ways. Okay, but that's not what we're seeing, right? I mean, we're seeing trafficking cases. We're seeing people who are being forced to do sex acts that they don't want to do, even in this legal environment of pornography.
Right.
And so, anyway, it's just one example of, okay, there's this bigger story. How are we going to have this conversation? So talking about buyers, talking about just this increase in demand that allows the existence of trafficking, that creates the existence of sex trafficking in the first place. And if that didn't exist, would there not be traffickers? Would there not be buyers? Would there not be victims?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, like we said before, we applaud your efforts. If somebody that's listening to the program wants to receive training from Truckers Against Trafficking, is it open to everyone?
Yeah, so obviously we work specifically in these industries because we recognize that they play a critical role in combating human trafficking.
Yes.
So a lot of the signs, a lot of our training can be, one, it is absolutely accessible to everyone. It's free. It's on our website. You can find all of our training videos, all of our resources to either download, view, or order from our website for free. We just want to make sure that people have this information. And two, if you aren't a member of the industry, you can definitely access this, especially our man-to-man resources that I was just mentioning. That really facilitates well in community groups, in friend circles, in family circles. And I do want to say, if you work for a company who orders or ships goods, you're interacting with a trucking company, right? If you take public transit, if you pay taxes in your area, you're paying into a school system, you're paying into a transit system, potentially depending on where you live, right? But definitely a school system.
Right.
That who you could use your influence and say, hey, have you actually heard of these free training resources for school bus drivers? Have you heard of this free training resource for our transit workers? Like, what about considering this? What about using this, getting us in touch with them? So most people, are connected to the transportation industry.
Yes.
And so acknowledging, seeing that, one, training yourself, two, training your family, three, recognizing where is that network? How can I make sure that these free resources are known, that they know they exist and they can access and use them.
Well, thank you so much. Like I said, it's such a worthwhile effort. We thank you for being on the show and for discussing, everything that you discussed today. It was very insightful for the both of us, and I'm sure our audience members are going to absolutely love it. For those people that are just starting to listen, again, truckersagainsttrafficking.org. You can listen to the Driving Freedom podcast. All of these are such good resources. And thank you so much for being on the show. We very much appreciate it.
Yes, thank you very much, guys.
Thanks so much for having us. I'm so glad to be here.
All right. Hopefully we'll talk soon, okay?
Talk soon. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Wow, that was such an intense podcast.
Yeah, it was. Usually I have a lot to say after our podcast interviews, but, both Annika and Helen, they just hit it out of the park. Yeah. They told us so much information, and I for one am glad that we had them on the show, and that Annika, I'm so glad she was able to share her experience, maybe to give some support to people going through the whole human trafficking as victims.
Definitely.
It's just, they're sad stories, but there's a silver lining. Like I said, her trafficker got life in prison without the possibility of parole.
Yeah, and we did talk about that too. Some of these sentences are sentencings are not long enough.
Right.
Right. That's the bad part.
Yeah, there definitely needs to be some sort of criminal justice reform, but I think that's in a variety of areas, not just human trafficking. But human trafficking really hits home, right? Especially with the kids and even the people that aren't kids, the adults, the way they're being manipulated and blackmailed and controlled. It's just
drugged.
very, very sad. Drugged, yeah. Yeah, very sad.
Well, I think we're going to wrap this up.
I think so.
Well, everyone, that's going to wrap up this week's show. If you have a story you want to share, or even if you want to be a guest, email us at info@themidnighttruckstop.com or call us at 909-993-3633. Please don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok at The Midnight Truck Stop. Until next time, keep the rubber side down and the bugs off the glass.